Chapter 1. The Fateful Lecture. The early morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Bramleigh College, casting a golden hue on the grand, ivy-covered buildings. It was a crisp autumn day, and the students shuffled across the cobblestone paths, their scarves fluttering in the light breeze. The college's Gothic architecture loomed over the grounds, a testament to its centuries-old history. Among the crowd of students making their way to the lecture hall were two best friends, Tony Middleton and Sally Cartwright, who had known each other since childhood.
"Honestly, I'm not sure what this lecture is even about," Tony muttered, adjusting his coat collar as they walked.
Sally, ever the optimist, smiled as she brushed a lock of her auburn hair from her face. Professor Blake always talks about something fascinating. Last week it was ancient crypts and buried treasure. Maybe today he'll reveal some secret about lost civilizations.
Tony chuckled. Or he'll drone on about pottery fragments like he did last semester. The two shared a light-hearted exchange as they reached the massive oak doors of the lecture hall. Inside, students were already filling the rows of wooden benches, the room buzzing with chatter. The hall was an impressive space, with high ceilings and walls lined with portraits of long-dead scholars, their stern faces watching over the current generation of learners. At the front of the room stood a large blackboard where Professor Edward Blake was already preparing for his lecture. Professor Blake was a man in his 50s, with thinning grey hair, sharp blue eyes, and an air of authority about him. He was known for his passionate lectures on history and archaeology, though some students whispered that his obsession with ancient secrets bordered on the fanatical. His tweed jacket, slightly worn at the elbows, gave him the appearance of a man who had spent more time in dusty libraries and far-flung ruins than in the comforts of modern life. Sally nudged Tony as they found seats near the middle of the hall. "Look at him, pacing around like he's about to reveal something monumental. I have a good feeling about today." Tony grinned. "You always do." As the clock struck the hour, Professor Blake tapped the podium with his cane, signaling the start of the lecture. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward him. "Good morning, students," he began, his voice deep and resonant. "Today, we delve into the mysteries of a civilization long forgotten by most historians, the Atlanteans. Scholars have dismissed their existence for centuries, but I have uncovered evidence that suggests otherwise." A murmur rippled through the room. Sally's eyes lit up with excitement, and even Tony leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite himself. Professor Blake continued, his hands gesturing animatedly as he spoke. "This is not mere speculation. I have come across ancient artifacts, hidden in plain sight, that point to the existence of an advanced society, one that predates the Egyptians, the Greeks, and even the Romans. And these artifacts, if properly studied, could change everything we know about history." The students exchanged glances. This wasn't the usual fare of dusty tombs and ancient relics. This was something far more exciting. Tony glanced at Sally, who was already scribbling down notes with feverish enthusiasm. Professor Blake's voice grew more intense, and his face flushed with emotion. "The discoveries I've made, the research I've compiled, will be revealed soon. But there are those who would rather see this knowledge buried, those who fear the truth. I have been warned to stop my investigations, but I refuse to be silenced." The tension in the room thickened. Tony noticed that Blake's hands were trembling as he spoke, and a sheen of sweat had appeared on the professor's brow. Something was wrong. "Today," Blake said, his voice quavering, His words faltered, and he suddenly clutched his chest, staggering backward. The students gasped, a wave of confusion spreading through the hall. For a moment, it seemed as though Blake had simply lost his balance, but then he collapsed to the floor, his cane clattering beside him. "Professor!" Sally cried, jumping to her feet. Chaos erupted as students rushed forward, some shouting for help, while others stood frozen in shock. Tony grabbed Sally's arm, pulling her back. "Stay back. Don't get caught in the crowd." At the front of the room, A few students knelt beside Blake, but it was clear that something was terribly wrong. One of them, Henry Matthews, a bright but troubled student, checked the professor's pulse and looked up, his face pale. "He's not breathing." Panic spread through the hall as more students poured in to help, but within minutes it became clear. Professor Edward Blake was dead. Tony and Sally stood in stunned silence, watching as the scene unfolded. A medical team was summoned, but there was nothing they could do. The lecture hall was emptied, and the students were told to return to their dormitories. Whispers of heart attack filled the air as the crowd dispersed. "I can't believe it," Sally murmured as they walked back across the college courtyard, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. "Just like that, he's gone." Tony was silent for a moment, his mind racing. The way Blake had clutched his chest, the tension in his voice as he spoke about being threatened, it didn't sit right with him. "Sally," he said slowly, "what if it wasn't a heart attack?" Sally looked up at him, her eyes wide. "You think someone did this to him?" "I don't know," Tony admitted, but something felt off. The way he collapsed, the things he said right before it happened. What if someone didn't want him revealing what he'd found? Sally's expression shifted from shock to curiosity. "You're thinking this is a murder, aren't you?" Tony shrugged, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. It wouldn't be the first time someone was silenced for knowing too much. Sally smiled, that familiar gleam of adventure flickering in her eyes. "Then I suppose we have a mystery to solve." As the two friends made their way back to their dormitory, the shadow of suspicion hung over them. The sudden death of Professor Blake was more than a tragedy. It was the start of something much darker. And Tony and Sally, with their sharp instincts and knack for uncovering secrets, were about to dive headfirst into a mystery that would change everything they thought they knew about their college and the people within it. Chapter 2: A College in Shock. The morning after Professor Edward Blake's sudden death, Tony and Sally found themselves sitting in the crowded dining hall of Bramleigh College, where the usual chatter had been replaced with a low murmur of anxiety and disbelief. The news of the professor's passing had spread quickly, and now it seemed that no one could talk about anything else. Sally stirred her tea absent-mindedly, her thoughts far from the plate of toast in front of her. "It doesn't make sense, Tony. How could Professor Blake just collapse like that?" Tony, equally distracted, was poking at his eggs with his fork, his mind churning with questions. "The official word is heart failure, but something's not right. Did you see the look on his face before he fell? And what he said? About threats and people wanting to silence him?" Sally nodded. "It was like he knew something bad was going to happen. I overheard some students saying he'd been acting strange all week, like he was paranoid or scared." Tony leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's more to this than what we're being told. The way he was clutching his chest didn't look like a normal heart attack to me. And why would he mention being threatened right before he collapsed?" Sally's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "You think someone might have poisoned him?" "I don't know yet," Tony said, frowning, "but I think we need to find out. We should start with his office. He must have kept notes or something about his research, and maybe there's a clue there." Sally smiled, that familiar spark of excitement lighting up her face. "Sneaking into a professor's office? Sounds like we're back to our old tricks." Tony grinned. "You wouldn't have it any other way." They finished their breakfast quickly and made their way across the campus toward the main building, where Professor Blake's office was located. The corridors inside the building were quieter than usual, the usual hum of student activity dampened by the shock of the professor's death. As they approached Blake's office, Tony glanced around to make sure they weren't being watched. The door was locked, as expected. "Do you have your hairpin?" Tony asked, nodding toward the door. Sally grinned, already pulling the small metal pin from her auburn hair. "You know I'm always prepared." Within moments, Sally had the door unlocked with a practiced ease, and they slipped inside, closing it softly behind them. The office was dimly lit by the weak morning light filtering through the narrow windows. It smelled faintly of dust and old books, with shelves lined from floor to ceiling with thick volumes on history, archaeology, and ancient civilizations. Professor Blake's desk sat at the center of the room, covered in papers, open books, and small trinkets from his travels. On one side of the desk was a half-written letter, the ink still fresh. Sally moved toward it, picking it up gingerly. "He was writing this recently," she whispered, reading aloud. "To whomever it may concern, I have uncovered something truly remarkable in my research, something that will change everything. However, I fear there are forces at work that will stop at nothing to keep this discovery from seeing the light of day. I must take precautions. I will—" The letter ended abruptly. Tony frowned. That sounds like he was about to reveal something important, but he didn't get the chance to finish it. Sally nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. Whoever these forces are, they must have been pretty serious if Blake felt threatened enough to take precautions. Tony moved to the desk, carefully sifting through the scattered papers. "Let's see if there's anything here that can tell us what he was working on." As they searched, Tony's hand brushed against a leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of research notes. He pulled it out, flipping through the pages. The entries were written in Blake's hurried scrawl, full of references to ancient civilizations, secret discoveries, and mentions of a particular artifact, the name of which had been scratched out multiple times. Sally leaned over his shoulder, reading along. "It sounds like he found something important, but why would he keep crossing out the name of the artifact? Maybe he was afraid that someone would get a hold of this journal and find out what he was working on," Tony suggested. "He must have thought it was safer to keep the specifics hidden." Just then, a soft creak echoed through the office, making them both freeze. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Tony quickly tucked the journal into his coat pocket, and they both ducked behind a large bookshelf, holding their breath as the door to the office swung open. Through the small gap between the books, they could see Henry Matthews, the student who had checked the professor's pulse in the lecture hall the day before. Henry's face was pale, and his hands trembled as he entered the room. He looked around nervously, then made his way toward the desk, rifling through the papers with an air of desperation. "What is he doing?" Sally whispered. Tony shook his head, watching intently. After a few moments, Henry muttered something under his breath, clearly frustrated that he couldn't find what he was looking for. He slammed his fist on the desk, then turned to leave, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as he disappeared from view. Once the coast was clear, Tony and Sally emerged from their hiding spot, exchanging puzzled glances. "What do you think Henry was looking for?" Sally asked. "Whatever it was, he seemed pretty desperate to find it," Tony replied. "And if he's sneaking around here, he might know more about the professor's death than he's letting on." Sally crossed her arms. First the letter, now this journal, and now Henry acting all suspicious? This is definitely not just a heart attack. Tony nodded, pulling the journal from his coat and flipping back to the last entry. "We need to find out what this artifact is. Blake was clearly trying to protect it, and I have a feeling it's connected to why he was killed." Before they could leave, they heard another sound. This time, a soft, deliberate knock at the office door. Tony quickly stashed the journal back in his coat, and they exchanged worried glances. "We can't be caught in here," Sally whispered. But before they could react, the door opened, and Inspector Frederick Hale stepped into the room, his sharp eyes scanning the office. He was a tall man with a stern face and a neatly trimmed mustache, dressed in the dark uniform of the local constabulary. "Well, well," the inspector said, his voice cold and authoritative. "What do we have here? 2 curious students snooping around in a dead man's office?" Sally swallowed nervously, but Tony stepped forward, keeping his voice steady. "We didn't mean any harm, Inspector. We think there's more to Professor Blake's death than a heart attack." Hale raised an eyebrow, clearly not impressed. "And what makes you say that, young man?" Tony hesitated for a moment, then spoke. Blake said he was being threatened. He was on to something big, something dangerous. He mentioned it in a letter he was writing. The inspector's gaze flickered with interest, but his face remained stern. That's for the police to investigate, not students playing detective. You two should stay out of this, or you'll find yourselves in trouble. But Inspector, Sally began, but Hale cut her off. I'll be looking into this further, he said firmly, turning to leave. But let me make one thing clear. Stay out of my way. As the door clicked shut behind him, Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. It was clear that Inspector Hale didn't trust them, and they couldn't rely on the police to dig deeper into the mystery. If they wanted to solve Professor Blake's murder, they would have to do it themselves. Chapter 3. The Three Suspects.
The next morning, the chill of autumn settled over Bramleigh College, casting a misty veil across the campus. Tony and Sally had spent the night poring over Professor Blake's journal, trying to decipher the fragmented clues about the artifact he had been researching and the cryptic warnings he had scribbled in the margins.
But the journal alone wasn't enough. They needed to understand who had the most to gain from Blake's death, and why. I still can't believe Henry was in the office yesterday, Sally said, her voice thoughtful, as they walked toward the college library. Do you really think he's involved in all of this?
Tony frowned, glancing down at the folded pages of notes he had tucked into his coat pocket. I'm not sure yet, but the way he was rummaging through Blake's desk, it's like he knew there was something important hidden there. And we can't forget what we overheard him saying about Blake accusing him of plagiarism. That's enough to make someone pretty angry.
Sally nodded, but Henry's not the only one who had a reason to dislike Blake. There's also Dr. Margaret Collins, the history professor who's been at odds with him for years. Rumor has it they had a huge falling out over some research they were working on together. And then there's Mr. James Withers, Tony added, the benefactor who poured money into Blake's research. He's been putting a lot of pressure on the professor to produce results. Maybe when Blake didn't deliver, Withers decided to take matters into his own hands. Sally sighed. 3 suspects, all with motives. But how do we figure out which one might have actually done it? We start by talking to them, Tony said. We need to know more about what was really going on between them and Blake. We'll start with Henry. An unexpected encounter with Henry Matthews. Tony and Sally made their way across the quad toward the library, where they knew Henry Matthews often spent his mornings. The large stone building stood like a fortress at the center of campus, its arched windows glowing softly in the pale morning light. When they entered, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood greeted them, the quiet hum of students studying in the reading rooms filling the space. Tony and Sally scanned the rows of desks until they spotted Henry hunched over a stack of papers in a far corner, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sally led the way, her voice gentle as she approached. Henry, do you have a moment? Henry looked up, startled at first, but his expression quickly turned guarded. Oh, it's you two. What do you want? Tony pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, his tone casual but direct. We saw you in Professor Blake's office yesterday. You were looking for something, weren't you? Henry's face paled, and his eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. I don't know what you're talking about. Come on, Henry, Sally said, sitting beside Tony. We're not here to accuse you of anything. We just want to know what's going on. If you know something about Blake's death, you need to tell us. For a moment, Henry hesitated, his fingers gripping the edges of the papers in front of him. Then, with a sigh, he slumped back in his chair. All right, fine. Yes, I was in his office, but I wasn't there to steal anything, if that's what you're thinking. Tony raised an eyebrow. Then what were you doing? Henry ran a hand through his messy hair, clearly agitated. I was looking for something Blake took from me. I wrote a paper a few months ago, a research proposal for my thesis, and Blake rejected it. He said it was unoriginal, that I'd plagiarized. But that's not true. I did all the research myself. I poured my heart into that paper, and I was sure it would get me the top marks. Sally leaned forward, her voice sympathetic. So why would Blake accuse you of plagiarism? Henry's eyes darkened with anger. Because he was jealous. My paper was about a theory that undermined some of his work, something he didn't want getting out. I don't know what he was up to, but I'm sure he wanted to suppress my research to protect his own reputation. I was hoping to find my paper in his office, maybe prove that he was using my ideas without giving me credit. Tony exchanged a glance with Sally. Henry's story was troubling, but it still didn't explain everything. Did you find what you were looking for? Tony asked. Henry shook his head. No. There was nothing there. I don't know what happened to my paper, but I know Blake had something to do with it. Sally's brow furrowed in thought. Do you think whatever Blake was hiding in his research could be related to why he was killed? Henry's eyes widened slightly, as if the thought hadn't occurred to him before. I don't know. Maybe. He was always secretive about his work, especially in the last few months. I heard rumors that he was working on something big, something involving an ancient artifact, but he never talked about it openly. Tony leaned back in his chair, processing the information. Henry had a motive, but his story made it seem like he was more of a victim of Blake's behavior than a perpetrator. Thanks, Henry, Tony said, standing up. We'll let you know if we find anything out. Henry nodded, his expression still conflicted. Good luck. I hope you find whoever's responsible for this mess. A heated rivalry with Dr. Collins. Next, Tony and Sally turned their attention to Dr. Margaret Collins, the history professor who had been involved in a long-standing rivalry with Blake. They knew she spent her mornings in her office on the third floor of the college's West Wing, and they made their way there, hoping for answers. Dr. Collins' office was starkly different from Blake's cluttered workspace. It was meticulously organized, with shelves full of neatly arranged books and papers. Dr. Collins herself was seated at her desk, her sharp features framed by graying hair pulled tightly into a bun. She looked up as they knocked on the door, her expression unreadable. Ah, Tony and Sally, isn't it? She said, her tone clipped. What brings you to my office this morning? Sally smiled politely. We were hoping to ask you a few questions about Professor Blake. We've been hearing a lot of rumors about the two of you, about the work you did together. Dr. Collins's eyes narrowed slightly. Rumors, is it? Well, I suppose the college is buzzing with all sorts of nonsense since Blake's unfortunate passing. Tony wasted no time getting to the point. It's no secret that you and Blake didn't get along. Some people even said you had a major falling out over your research. What happened between you two? Dr. Collins pursed her lips, clearly irritated by the question. Blake and I worked together on a joint project years ago. It was promising at first. He had some interesting theories, I'll admit. But as the project progressed, it became clear that he was more interested in glory than in the pursuit of knowledge. He started cutting corners, making claims that weren't backed by solid evidence. When I confronted him about it, he dismissed me, said I was holding him back. Sally tilted her head. So you ended the partnership? Dr. Collins nodded curtly. I had no choice. My reputation was at stake. I couldn't be associated with someone who was willing to sacrifice academic integrity for the sake of fame. But Blake, he never forgave me for walking away from the project. He saw it as a betrayal. Tony folded his arms. Sounds like things got pretty heated between the two of you. They did, Dr. Collins admitted, her voice softening slightly. Blake was a brilliant man, but he was also reckless. He wanted to be remembered as one of the greats, and I think that blinded him to the dangers of his work. Sally's brow furrowed. Dangers? Dr. Collins hesitated, then sighed. Blake was obsessed with an ancient artifact, something he believed could change the course of history. I don't know all the details, but I do know that his research was attracting attention from unsavory figures. He was warned to stop his work, but he refused. That's when I knew it was only a matter of time before something went terribly wrong. Tony exchanged a glance with Sally. Dr. Collins's story was compelling, but it still didn't point directly to her being involved in Blake's death. However, It was clear that Blake had made enemies, both academic and otherwise. "Thank you for your time, Dr. Collins," Tony said as they stood to leave. "We appreciate your honesty." Dr. Collins nodded, though her eyes were distant, as if she were lost in thought. "Be careful, the both of you. Blake's work was dangerous, and if you're not careful, you could find yourselves in over your heads." Mr. Withers and the financial pressure. The final suspect on their list was Mr. James Withers, the wealthy benefactor who had been funding Blake's research. Withers was known for his lavish donations to the college, but he also had a reputation for being ruthless when it came to his investments. Tony and Sally arranged a meeting with him at his estate, a sprawling manor just outside the city. The estate was everything they expected: grand, imposing, and filled with expensive artwork and furnishings. Withers himself was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with slick-back hair and an air of authority that made him seem larger than life. "Ah, the two young sleuths," Withers greeted them with a booming voice as he entered the drawing room where they were waiting. "I've heard about your little investigation. Quite the pair of detectives, aren't you?" Tony smiled politely, though he didn't miss the condescending tone in Withers's voice. "We're just trying to get to the truth, Mr. Withers. We've been looking into the people closest to Professor Blake, and your name came up." Withers chuckled, though there was no warmth in the sound. "Yes, I was close to Blake, closer than most, in fact. I've been funding his research for years, and I expected results. But, well, as you can see, that didn't quite work out, did it?" Sally tilted her head, studying Withers carefully. "You must have been disappointed when Blake didn't deliver the results you were hoping for." Withers' eyes flashed with irritation. "Disappointed? That's an understatement. I invested a fortune into his work, money that could have gone to other projects, mind you. And what do I get in return? A dead professor and a pile of useless research notes." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Did you ever pressure him to move faster? Maybe even threaten to pull your funding if he didn't produce something?" Withers smirked. "I'm a businessman, young man. Of course I put pressure on him. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying. Blake was an ambitious fool, but he was also stubborn. No amount of threats or financial pressure would have made him back down from his research." Sally frowned. "What do you know about the artifact he was studying?" Withers shrugged. "Not much. He kept the details vague, even with me. All I know is that he believed it was the key to something revolutionary. But I'm not one to put much stock in ancient trinkets." Tony studied Withers's face, trying to gauge his sincerity. The man seemed confident, unbothered by their questions, but there was something about his casual dismissal of Blake's work that didn't sit right. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Withers," Tony said finally. "We'll be in touch if we have any more questions." Withers smiled, but the look in his eyes was cold. "I doubt you'll find anything of interest, but good luck with your little investigation." A growing mystery. As Tony and Sally left Withers' estate, their minds were buzzing with new information. Each of their suspects, Henry, Dr. Collins, and Withers, had a motive to want Professor Blake dead, but none of them had provided concrete proof that they were responsible for his murder. "We've got 3 suspects, all with reasons to want Blake out of the picture," Sally mused as they walked back toward the college. "But no clear answers. This isn't going to be easy." Tony nodded, deep in thought. "There's something bigger going on here. Blake's research was dangerous, and whoever killed him did it to stop whatever he was about to reveal. We're missing something, Sally, a key piece of the puzzle." Sally smiled, determination shining in her eyes. "Then we'll just have to keep digging until we find it." The mystery was far from solved, but one thing was certain. Tony and Sally were getting closer to the truth, and they wouldn't stop until they uncovered the real killer. Chapter 4. A Dangerous Discovery.
Tony and Sally, after their conversations with Henry Matthews, Dr. Collins, and Mr. Withers, were no closer to finding out who had killed Professor Blake, but they knew they were circling something important.
Sally's face was etched with determination as they stood near the entrance to the college archives, a quiet, often overlooked wing of the campus that held the most precious historical documents of the university. Blake mentioned that artifact in his journal, she said, pulling her coat tighter around her. If we can find out what that artifact was, we might get closer to understanding why he was killed. Tony nodded, equally focused. The archives are where he spent a lot of his time. If he was researching something dangerous, this is the place to start. The two friends walked into the dimly lit archive room, the heavy door creaking closed behind them. Inside, rows upon rows of ancient tomes and delicate manuscripts filled the shelves, some so fragile they seemed as though a single breath might turn them to dust. There were no students here, only Mr. Oliver Green, the college librarian, who sat behind his desk scribbling notes on a stack of papers. He was an older man, with sharp eyes behind thick spectacles, and though he seemed absorbed in his work, he glanced up sharply when Tony and Sally entered. "What can I do for you two today?" Mr. Green asked, his tone neutral but his gaze slightly suspicious. The librarian was known for being protective of the archives, and students didn't usually visit without good reason. Sally, always quick on her feet, smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Green. We're doing some research related to Professor Blake's work, and we thought the archives might have something useful. Do you know if Professor Blake had any documents stored here?" Mr. Green's gaze flickered for a moment. "Blake? Yes, I recall he spent a lot of time here, always digging through the ancient records. Strange fellow, really, but brilliant." He paused, eyeing them both carefully. "What exactly are you looking for?" "We're looking for anything related to an artifact Professor Blake might have been researching. He didn't mention what it was, but it seemed like it was something valuable. Could we look through the records?" said Tony. The librarian hesitated. "Well, Blake did leave behind some notes and documents. I haven't had a chance to go through them myself, but they're kept in a locked section of the archives. I suppose I could let you have a look, given the circumstances." He stood up and motioned for them to follow. The locked cabinet. Mr. Green led them through the narrow aisles of the archives, deeper into the back where the older, more fragile documents were kept. The air grew colder, and the light dimmer, as they approached a large wooden cabinet secured with a heavy lock. Mr. Green pulled a key from his coat pocket and unlocked the door with a slow, deliberate motion. "This is where we store some of the rarer documents," he explained as he opened the cabinet doors, revealing rows of carefully bound manuscripts, letters, and ledgers. "Blake's papers are in the second drawer. Be careful with them, they're fragile." Tony and Sally nodded, and the librarian left them alone, retreating to his desk at the front of the archives. Tony pulled open the drawer and gently lifted out a bundle of yellowed pages tied together with a piece of old string. It looked as though Blake had been compiling notes for years. Sally carefully untied the string and began sifting through the papers. "Look at this," she said softly, pointing to a faded diagram of an ancient relic. "This must be the artifact Blake was researching. It's some kind of ceremonial object, something to do with an ancient civilization." Tony examined the drawing. "But what's so important about it? It looks like any other relic you'd find in a museum." Sally flipped through more of the papers, her eyes scanning the notes. "It says here that the artifact holds a hidden secret, something that could unlock untold knowledge about the civilization it came from. Blake believed that whoever controlled the artifact would control that knowledge." Tony's eyes widened. That would explain why someone might want to stop him. If Blake was close to finding something important, it could have made him a target. As they continued to search through the papers, Tony pulled out a letter that had been tucked away beneath the stack of notes. The letter was addressed to Blake from an unknown sender, the handwriting elegant but rushed. "Professor Blake, you have been warned countless times to stop your inquiries. The artifact is not meant for you, nor should it be revealed to the public. If you continue down this path, you will face consequences. This is your final warning." Sally's breath caught in her throat. Tony, This letter, someone threatened him. They told him to stop his research, but he didn't listen. Tony's grip on the letter tightened. This is proof that Blake was murdered. But who sent this? Before they could ponder the question further, they heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, Tony shoved the letter into his coat pocket, and Sally carefully closed the drawer. They turned to see Mr. Oliver Green reappearing at the end of the aisle, his sharp eyes glinting behind his glasses. "Find what you were looking for?" Mr. Green asked, his tone polite, but his gaze lingering a little too long on the drawer they had just closed. Tony nodded, forcing a casual smile. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Green. This was helpful." The librarian gave them a tight smile in return. "Good. Now, if you're done, I think it's best you two leave the archives. These documents are delicate, after all." Sally and Tony exchanged a glance, sensing that their welcome was wearing thin. "Of course," Sally said brightly. "Thanks for your help." "A close call," Sally said, her expression thoughtful. "Who could have sent the letter? It could be any of our suspects. Dr. Collins would have had access to his work, and Withers certainly had the influence to scare Blake into stopping his research. And then there's Henry, who might have been desperate enough to take things into his own hands." Tony shook his head. "We're missing something. Blake was working on this artifact, but what was so dangerous about it? Why did someone feel the need to kill him to keep it hidden?" Before Sally could respond, they heard footsteps behind them, quick, deliberate footsteps. They turned to see Mr. Oliver Green, the librarian, walking briskly in their direction, his face set in a frown. "Wait," he called after them, his voice sharp. Tony and Sally exchanged worried glances. They hadn't thought Green had suspected them of anything, but now it seemed he was following them. "We need to get out of here," Tony whispered urgently. Without another word, the two of them darted down a narrow alley between two of the college buildings, ducking out of sight. They could hear Mr. Green's footsteps growing louder as he neared, but they remained hidden in the shadows, holding their breath. After what felt like an eternity, Green's footsteps faded into the distance, and the friends finally exhaled, their hearts pounding in their chests. "That was close," Sally whispered. "Why do you think he was following us?" "I don't know," Tony replied, "but it seems like he didn't want us looking through those documents." Sally frowned. "You don't think? Mr. Green could be involved, do you?" Tony hesitated. "It's possible. He's in charge of the archives, and he would have known about Blake's research. But why would a librarian kill someone over an artifact?" "I don't know," Sally said slowly, "but we need to be careful. Whoever killed Blake clearly doesn't want us finding out the truth." Tony nodded in agreement. The next clue. Back in their dormitory, Tony and Sally spread out the papers they had collected from the archives, including the letter they had found. As they pieced through the notes, a pattern began to emerge. "The artifact is part of a larger puzzle," Sally said, pointing to one of Blake's notes. He believed it was connected to an ancient civilization, but it wasn't just a historical object. It had some kind of hidden power, or knowledge, as Blake put it. Tony nodded. "And that's why someone didn't want him to uncover it. If this artifact had the potential to change what we know about history, it could be worth a lot of money. Or influence." Sally's eyes narrowed. "And people will kill for that." Tony folded his arms, deep in thought. "We need to figure out who sent that letter. It's our best lead right now, and we need to find out what happened to the artifact. If Blake had it, where is it now?" Sally leaned back in her chair. "We'll need to talk to Dr. Collins again. She knew Blake better than anyone. Maybe she knows more than she's letting on." Tony nodded in agreement. "And we should keep an eye on Mr. Green. If he's involved, he's going to make another move soon."
Chapter 5. Secrets in the Shadows.
Inside their dimly lit dorm room, Tony sat hunched over Professor Blake's journal, flipping through pages of scribbled notes and cryptic references to the mysterious artifact. Sally, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was studying a map of the college they had borrowed from the archives. Look at this, Tony said suddenly, breaking the silence. He tapped the journal. Blake mentions meeting someone in secret, someone who knew about the artifact. He doesn't give a name, but he refers to this person as a trusted colleague. Sally glanced up. A trusted colleague? That could be anyone. Dr. Collins, Henry Matthews, or even Mr. Withers. But why would he need to meet them in secret? Tony shrugged. That's the part I don't get. Whoever this person was, Blake didn't want anyone to know about their meetings. He even writes that he was worried about being watched. Sally stood up and paced the room, the soft creak of the wooden floor echoing in the quiet. It's clear that Blake was in deeper trouble than anyone realized. We know he was being threatened, but if he was meeting someone secretly, it means this person was involved in something dangerous, maybe more than just academic rivalry. Tony nodded, and that person might know who sent that letter warning Blake to stop his research. A visit to Dr. Collins. Their first stop was Dr. Margaret Collins' office. The narrow corridors of the history department felt colder than usual as Tony and Sally made their way to Dr. Collins' office. When they knocked on the heavy oak door, it swung open a crack, revealing Dr. Collins seated at her desk. She looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of the two students. "Back again, are we? What is it this time?" Sally stepped forward, her voice calm but insistent. "We need to talk to you about Professor Blake. We've been going through his notes, and we found references to a trusted colleague, someone he was meeting in secret. We thought you might know who that was." Dr. Collins paused, her fingers lingering on the edge of a page. For a moment the room was filled with silence, the only sound the faint rustle of paper. She removed her glasses and leaned back in her chair, studying them carefully. "So, you've been playing detectives, have you?" she said, her tone edged with sarcasm. "And now you want me to help you solve a mystery?" "We're just trying to understand what happened," Tony said evenly. "Blake trusted you once. Did he come to you for help before he died?" Dr. Collins looked at them. After a long pause, she sighed and leaned forward. "Blake and we weren't exactly on speaking terms in the months leading up to his death, but that doesn't mean I didn't know what he was up to. He had a habit of reaching out to old colleagues when he got in over his head, especially when it came to his research on that blasted artifact." Sally's eyes widened. "So you knew about the artifact?" "Of course I knew about it," Dr. Collins snapped. "We started that research together, years ago. But when Blake became obsessed with it, convinced it was the key to something monumental, I backed out. I had no interest in chasing myths." "But someone else did," Tony said, catching on. "Someone Blake trusted." Dr. Collins nodded slowly. "I'm not sure who he was meeting in secret, but I do know he'd been in contact with some unsavory figures. People who weren't exactly in academia, if you catch my meaning. They wanted that artifact for themselves. That's why I walked away from the project. Blake wouldn't listen to reason. He was too blinded by the potential discovery." Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. This new information complicated things. "Thank you, Dr. Collins," Sally said quietly, sensing that the conversation was nearing its end. Dr. Collins nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "Be careful, you two. Blake's death wasn't an accident. Whoever's involved in this won't think twice about getting rid of anyone who gets in their way." An unlikely source. Leaving Dr. Collins's office, Tony and Sally walked across the fog-drenched quad. Sally suddenly stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening with realization. "Tony, what about Henry Matthews? He was accused of plagiarism. But what if it wasn't just about the paper? What if he was involved in something bigger, something that connected him to Blake's secret meetings?" Tony frowned. "You think Henry was more involved in Blake's research than he let on?" "It's possible," Sally said. "Maybe Blake wasn't the only one who was in over his head. Henry could have been working with Blake on the artifact, and when things started to get dangerous, Blake tried to distance himself. That might explain why Henry was so desperate to find something in Blake's office." Tony considered her theory. It made sense. Henry had motive, access to Blake's research, and a reason to feel betrayed, but they needed to hear it from him directly. "Let's go find him," Tony said. "If Henry's hiding something, it's time we found out what." Henry's confession. They found Henry Matthews in the college library, seated in his usual spot near the back. He looked up nervously as they approached. "We need to talk, Henry," Tony said. "It's about Professor Blake and the artifact he was researching." Henry's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about." Sally sat down across from him, her eyes steady. "We know you were involved in Blake's research, Henry. We also know that Blake was meeting someone in secret, someone he trusted. Was it you?" For a long moment, Henry said nothing. His hands fidgeted with the edge of a book. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and trembling. All right, I admit it. I was working with Blake. But it wasn't like you think. I wasn't the one meeting him in secret. It was someone else, someone from outside the college." Tony leaned in closer, his curiosity piqued. Who? Who was it, Henry?" Henry swallowed hard. "I don't know his name. Blake just called him the benefactor. He was funding the research, paying Blake to find the artifact. But Blake was getting nervous. He knew that this man, this benefactor, was dangerous. He tried to pull out of the deal, but it was too late. They wouldn't let him go." Sally's heart pounded in her chest. "Are you saying Blake was killed because he tried to back out of the deal?" Henry nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Yes, Blake knew too much. And now I'm afraid they'll come after me too." But now Tony and Sally were in danger too. They had stumbled into something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. "We have to go to Inspector Hale," Tony said urgently, standing up. "He needs to know everything we've uncovered." The shadow of the benefactor. The benefactor had funded Blake's research, pressured him, and ultimately murdered him when Blake tried to pull out. But who was this shadowy figure, and how deep did his influence run? Tony and Sally's steps quickened as they approached Hale's office. "Tony," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "do you feel like we're being watched?" Tony's eyes scanned the misty street, his instincts kicking in, but there was no one in sight. "Let's get inside," he said quietly. "We'll be safe once we tell Hale everything." But as they reached the inspector's door, they found it slightly ajar. A bad feeling knotted in Tony's stomach as he pushed it open. The office was empty, the gas lamps flickering softly. "Inspector Hale," Sally called out, stepping inside. There was no answer. The room was eerily silent. And then they saw it, a small folded piece of paper lying on the inspector's desk. Tony picked it up, his hands shaking as he opened it. The message was short, written in elegant but hurried handwriting. "Leave this alone, or you'll end up like Blake."
Chapter 6. Into the Lion's Den.
The air in Inspector Hale's empty office was thick with tension. Tony and Sally stood frozen, the note in Tony's hand trembling as they processed the chilling threat. "Tony, this is serious," Sally whispered, her voice shaking. "Whoever the benefactor is, they know we're getting close." Tony nodded, crumpling the note in his hand. "And they've made sure to let us know that they'll stop at nothing to keep us from finding out the truth." "We need to find Hale," Tony said decisively. "He's the only one who can help us now." Sally turned back to the desk, a determined look crossing her face. "Then we're going to have to track him down ourselves. We can't afford to wait around. If Hale is out there, he's investigating the same people we are." Tony nodded, and the two of them left the office. A hidden trail. Their first stop was the college records office. If Hale was investigating, he might have left behind a paper trail, or at least some clue about where he had gone. Sally pulled open the creaky door, and they slipped inside, immediately met with the smell of old parchment and ink. "Start with Hale's files," Tony whispered, already moving toward a section labeled Police Investigations. Sally began flipping through drawers, her fingers skimming over documents as she searched for anything with Hale's name on it. After several tense minutes, she pulled out a folder marked Blake, Incident Report. "Got something," Sally said, setting the file on the desk. They opened the folder together, quickly scanning its contents. Inside were Hale's initial notes from the day Professor Blake had died, along with a list of individuals he had planned to interview in connection with the case. Tony's eyes narrowed as he looked over the list. "Look at this. Henry Matthews, Dr. Collins, Mr. Withers. He's interviewed all of them." Sally frowned. "But we already know that. What's missing here?" They continued flipping through the notes, and then something caught Sally's eye. At the bottom of the page, written in faint pencil, was a single name that hadn't been on their radar before. Oliver Green, the college librarian. "Why would Hale be interested in Green?" Tony asked. Sally's eyes widened as she remembered their encounter in the archives with Mr. Green. "Wait, Green was acting strangely the other day when we were in the archives. He followed us out after we were looking through Blake's notes. What if he knows more than we think?" Tony's mind raced. Green's been guarding those archives for years. He would have had access to everything Blake was working on. If Blake hid something in there, like the artifact itself, Green could have found it. Sally's heart quickened. "And if Green's involved, he might be working with the benefactor." Tony nodded, closing the file. "We need to get to the archives. If Hale was investigating Green, that's where he might have gone." A dangerous meeting. The college archives loomed ahead as Tony and Sally made their way across the campus. When they reached the archives, the large wooden doors were closed, but a faint glow of light seeped through the cracks. "He's inside," Tony whispered. As they stepped further inside the archive room, they saw Inspector Hale standing near a row of shelves, his back to them. He was flipping through a file, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Hale," Tony called softly. The inspector turned, startled. "Tony, Sally, what are you doing here?" "We've been looking for you," Sally said urgently. "We found a note in your office. Someone's threatening us, Hale. We're getting too close to the truth." Hale frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of note?" Tony pulled the crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Hale. The inspector's face darkened as he read it, his jaw tightening. "So it's true," Hale muttered under his breath. "They're trying to scare you off." Sally stepped closer, her voice low. "What did you find here, Inspector? We saw your notes. You were investigating Oliver Green. Is he involved in Blake's murder?" Hale glanced around the room, his eyes darting toward the shadowy corners, as if he expected someone to be lurking. "I don't know for sure yet, but Green is definitely hiding something. I've been following his activities for days, and it seems like he's been going in and out of the archives at strange hours. I believe he's involved with this benefactor you mentioned." Tony and Sally exchanged a glance. "So Green's working with the benefactor?" Tony asked. Hale nodded grimly. "It looks that way. And I think Blake hid the artifact in these archives. Green must have found it after Blake's death. That's why he's been so secretive." Sally's heart pounded. "So Green has the artifact now?" Before Hale could answer, the creak of a floorboard echoed through the room, followed by the soft click of a door closing. "Someone's here," Tony whispered. Hale's hand instinctively moved to the gun at his side. "Stay behind me," he ordered. As they approached the far end of the archives, they saw a figure moving between the shelves. A tall man in a dark coat, his back turned to them as he rifled through a set of papers. It was Oliver Green. Hale motioned for Tony and Sally to stay put as he stepped forward, drawing his pistol. "Mr. Green," he said, his voice cold and commanding, "you're under investigation for the murder of Professor Blake." Green froze, his hands hovering over the papers he had been searching through. Slowly, he turned to face them, his face pale but calm. "Inspector Hale," Green said quietly, his voice smooth and collected. "I don't know what you think you've found, but I assure you, you're mistaken." Hale stepped closer, his eyes narrowed. "Cut the act, Green. We know you've been working with the benefactor. We know you've been hiding the artifact." A flicker of something passed across Green's face. Fear, perhaps, or anger, but it was quickly replaced by a practiced calm. "You don't understand, Inspector. You're playing a dangerous game." Tony and Sally watched as Hale pressed forward. "Where's the artifact, Green? What did you do with it?" Green's expression hardened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he lunged toward the shelves, knocking over a stack of books as he made a run for the exit. Without thinking, Tony and Sally dashed after him, their feet pounding against the wooden floor as they chased Green through the maze of shelves. Green reached the door first, throwing it open and disappearing into the fog, but Tony and Sally weren't far behind. They burst through the door, the cold night air hitting them like a wall, and they saw Green's silhouette disappearing down a narrow alley that led away from the campus. "He's getting away," Sally shouted. But just as they rounded the corner of the alley, they heard the sharp crack of a gunshot. Tony skidded to a stop. Ahead of them, Green stumbled, clutching his side as he collapsed to the ground. Hale appeared behind them, his gun still smoking. He lowered it slowly, his face grim. "It's over," Hale said quietly. They rushed forward, kneeling beside Green's fallen form. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Green gasped, his voice weak but defiant. "The benefactor. You'll never find him." Tony's heart pounded as he leaned closer. "Who is he, Green? Tell us." But Green only smiled, a cold, cruel smile, and with a final, rattling breath, he closed his eyes. He was dead, a deadly silence. Tony and Sally stared down at Green's lifeless body, the weight of the moment sinking in. "We're too late," Sally whispered. "He's gone." Hale holstered his gun, his face grim as he looked down at the dead man. Green was only part of this. The benefactor is still out there. Sally looked up at Hale, her voice steadied despite the fear in her eyes. "What do we do now, Inspector?" Hale met her gaze, his expression hard. "We find the benefactor, and we stop him before he does this to anyone else." Chapter 7. The Unseen Hand. Sitting in the small common room of their dormitory, Tony and Sally stared at the scattered notes and documents they had collected throughout the investigation. Tea. "We're missing something," Tony muttered, pacing the room. "Green was working with the benefactor, but he didn't tell us who. We need to figure out who's behind all of this before they strike again." Sally frowned, flipping through Blake's journal for the 100th time. "I agree, but it feels like we're chasing a ghost. We have no name, no face, just vague references to a powerful figure pulling the strings." Tony stopped pacing and looked at her. "We know Green was involved, and we know Blake was receiving funding for his research from this mysterious benefactor. If we can follow the money, we might find out who's behind it all." Sally raised an eyebrow. "You think it's someone wealthy? Like Mr. Withers?" Tony shrugged. "Withers is wealthy and invested in Blake's research, but we haven't found anything concrete linking him to the murder or the artifact. I don't think we can rule him out yet." Sally leaned forward, tapping her finger against the journal. "There's something else that's been bothering me. Remember how Blake referred to unsavory figures getting involved with his research? What if the benefactor isn't just a financier, but someone with dangerous connections, someone with the means to make people disappear?" Tony's expression grew serious. "Someone like a criminal or a smuggler?" "Exactly," Sally said, nodding. "Maybe the benefactor is part of a larger network. If Blake's research led to something valuable, something like the artifact, it could be worth a fortune on the black market. That would explain why they killed Blake when he tried to back out." Tony considered her theory. "That could be it, but where do we even begin looking for someone like that?" Before Sally could answer, the door creaked open, and Inspector Hale stepped inside, his expression grim. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Hale said, glancing at the papers spread out on the table. "But I think it's time we shared some information. We're all in this together now, and things are getting more dangerous by the minute." Tony motioned for Hale to join them. We've been going over what we know. We think the benefactor might be more than just a wealthy financier, maybe someone with criminal ties. Hale nodded as he sat down. That's what I've been thinking too. After Green's death last night, I started digging into his background. Turns out he had some shady connections in the past, people who dealt in stolen artifacts and rare goods. It's possible Green was the middleman, helping the benefactor get access to Blake's research. Sally's eyes widened. That makes sense. Green was guarding the archives. He would have known exactly what Blake was working on. Hale leaned forward, his expression serious. But there's more. I spoke to some contacts at the station this morning, and they've been hearing whispers about a powerful figure in the black market for ancient artifacts, a man known only as the Baron. No one knows his real name, but he's notorious for funding expeditions to recover rare and valuable items from archaeological sites, then selling them to the highest bidder. Tony's heart raced. You think the benefactor is this Baron? Hale nodded slowly. It's possible. Blake's research could have led him to something the Baron wanted. And when Blake tried to pull out of the deal, the Baron had him killed. Sally frowned. But why go to all this trouble? What's so special about the artifact Blake was researching? Hale's expression darkened. I think the artifact is more than just a historical relic. From what I've gathered, Blake believed it held some kind of hidden power or knowledge, something that could change everything we know about ancient civilizations. If that's true, the artifact would be priceless. The Baron would do anything to get his hands on it. We need to find the artifact before the Baron does, Tony said. It's the only way to stop him. Hale stood up. Agreed. And I think I know where to start. If Green was the middleman, he would have hidden the artifact somewhere close, somewhere the Baron could get to it quickly. Sally's eyes lit up. The archives. It has to be there. Green was always guarding them. Hale's gaze darkened. Then we move quickly. We don't know how long we have before the Baron, or his associates, come looking for it. A race against time. The three entered the archives with a set determination. We need to focus on the areas Green spent the most time in, Hale said, scanning the rows of shelves. He would have kept the artifact hidden somewhere no one would think to look. Sally pulled out a small flashlight from her coat and began methodically searching the rows of shelves. Tony followed suit, carefully examining the bookshelves and cabinets. After several tense minutes, Sally's voice broke the silence. Over here, she whispered, excitement tinging her voice. Tony and Hale rushed over to where Sally was standing, near a tall, narrow bookshelf in the back corner of the room. Sally had pulled a large, dusty volume off the shelf, revealing a small, hidden compartment behind it. Inside the compartment was a small, intricately carved box, its surface adorned with ancient symbols. This is it, Tony whispered, reaching for the box. But before he could touch it, the door to the archives burst open, and three men in dark coats stormed inside. Their faces were obscured by the shadows, but the glint of steel in their hands made it clear that they were armed. Step away from the box, one of the men growled, his voice low and dangerous. Hale reached for his gun, but one of the men was faster, raising his own weapon and pointing it directly at them. Don't even think about it, Inspector. We're not here to play games. Who are you working for? Hale demanded. The man with the gun sneered. You already know the answer to that, Inspector. The Baron wants what's his, and he doesn't care who gets in his way. Tony's grip tightened on the box as he glanced at Sally. Sally's eyes flicked to the window at the far end of the archives, where the fog swirled outside, barely visible through the cracked glass. It was a long shot, but it might be their only chance. Now, hand over the artifact, the man ordered, stepping closer. Tony hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't give them the artifact, but if they tried to fight, someone would get hurt, or worse. In a split-second decision, Sally grabbed a nearby book from the shelf and hurled it at the man holding the gun. The book struck him in the arm, knocking his aim off just long enough for Tony to shove the box into Hale's hands. Go, Tony shouted, sprinting toward the window as the men recovered from the distraction. Hale followed Tony's lead, smashing the glass with the butt of his gun and clearing the way for their escape. Sally was right behind them as they climbed through the window and into the thick fog outside. Gunshots rang out behind them, but the fog swallowed the sounds as they ran. The chase begins. "Where do we go?" Sally panted, glancing over her shoulder. Hale gripped the box tightly as they ran. "We need to get to the police station. It's the only place we'll be safe." But Tony wasn't so sure. The benefactor's men seemed to be everywhere, and they had already proven they would stop at nothing to get the artifact. As they rounded a corner, a figure stepped out of the fog, blocking their path. For a split second, Tony's heart froze. Had they been caught? But as the figure stepped closer, they realized it wasn't one of the benefactor's men. It was Mr. James Withers. His face was pale, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. "Hale," Withers said slowly, his voice calm but tense. "What's going on here?" Hale's eyes narrowed. "We don't have time for this, Withers. We're being chased." But Withers didn't move. Instead, he glanced at the box in Hale's hands, his gaze darkening. "That's the artifact, isn't it?"
Tony's heart sank as realization dawned.
Withers wasn't just an innocent benefactor. He was the Baron, the mastermind behind the entire plot.
Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation.
Tony, Sally, and Inspector Hale stood frozen, staring at Mr. James Withers. His pale face was set in a cold, calculating expression, and his eyes gleamed with a deadly calm as they flicked from the artifact in Hale's hands to the trio blocking his path. Tony's heart pounded in his chest as the pieces fell into place. Withers, with his wealth and influence, had used his position as a benefactor of the college to manipulate Blake, funding his research while secretly working with criminals like Oliver Green to secure the artifact. When Blake had tried to pull out, Withers had ordered his death. "Hand over the artifact," Withers said softly, his voice like a snake's hiss. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Hale tightened his grip on the small carved box, stepping in front of Tony and Sally protectively. "We know enough, Withers. You've been behind this from the beginning. Blake's death, the threats, the murders, it all leads back to you." Withers's lips curled into a thin smile. Blake was a fool. He thought he could use the artifact for academic glory, but he didn't understand its true value. He was too focused on his research to see the bigger picture. When he became a liability, I had no choice. Sally stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "No choice. You killed him because he wouldn't do what you wanted, and now you're trying to get the artifact to sell it on the black market." Withers's smile faded, his expression hardening. "You're out of your depth, young lady. This isn't about selling a mere relic. The artifact holds something far more valuable than you can imagine." Tony's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? What's so important about the artifact?" Withers's eyes flickered with a dark intensity as he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "The artifact is a key to unlocking knowledge lost to history. It contains secrets about an ancient civilization that predated even the Egyptians. Whoever controls that knowledge controls power beyond anything the world has ever seen. And I intend to be that person." Sally gasped. "So that's what this is all about? Power?" Withers nodded, his gaze locked on the artifact in Hale's hands. "Power, wealth, control. The world is on the brink of change, and whoever holds that knowledge will shape the future." "You're insane," Hale said, his voice low and firm. "You've killed innocent people, manipulated everyone around you, all for some ancient secret." Withers's smile returned, but it was colder now, more dangerous. "And I'm willing to do far more if it means securing the artifact. Now give it to me." "We'll never give it to you," Tony said, his voice steady. Withers's eyes narrowed, his smile fading completely. "Then you leave me no choice." Before anyone could react, Withers snapped his fingers, and from the fog behind him, his armed men appeared. 3 shadowy figures with guns drawn, stepping forward to block any escape. They were trapped. A desperate plan. For a split second, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The armed men advanced. Withers's expression turned into one of triumph, and Tony could feel the cold press of fear tightening around his chest. But Sally wasn't going to wait for them to be cornered. Without hesitation, she grabbed Tony's arm and whispered urgently, "Run." In an instant, they bolted toward the alley leading deeper into the campus, dodging between the towering buildings and disappearing into the thick fog. Hale was right behind them, still clutching the artifact as they raced through the dark, twisting alleyways. "We can't outrun them forever," Tony panted. "We need to find somewhere to hide or make a stand." Sally's eyes darted around. "There's an old chapel near the south end of the grounds. We can barricade ourselves in there." Hale nodded. "Lead the way. We need to protect this artifact at all costs." They sprinted through the winding alleys and across the college quad, the chapel's towering silhouette rising ahead of them like a beacon. The chapel was cold and dark, the high vaulted ceilings casting eerie shadows in the dim light from the stained glass windows. "We need to barricade the door," Hale said, already pulling a pew across the stone floor to block the entrance. Tony and Sally hurried to help, their muscles straining as they heaved several pews into place, forming a makeshift barricade. Outside, the muffled voices of Withers and his men echoed through the thick walls of the chapel. They had found them. "They're going to break in," Tony said, fear creeping into his voice. Hale nodded grimly, his hand resting on the small pistol at his side. "We'll hold them off as long as we can, but we need a plan." Sally's mind raced, her thoughts moving faster than she could process. Then it hit her. "We destroy it," Sally said, her voice low but certain. Tony and Hale stared at her, shocked. "Destroy it?" Tony asked, his eyes wide. "But it's an ancient artifact. It could hold answers to history." Sally shook her head, her gaze locked on the box Hale was still holding. "This isn't just about history anymore, Tony. If Withers gets his hands on it, he'll use it for power, for control. We can't let that happen. The only way to stop him is to make sure the artifact is gone." Hale hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. "She's right. The artifact is too dangerous. We destroy it, and Withers loses his leverage." With a heavy sigh, Hale set the box on the stone floor of the chapel, pulling open the lid to reveal the ancient relic inside. It was a small, intricately carved stone tablet, its surface covered in strange symbols and markings that seemed to glow faintly. "We'll smash it," Hale said, picking up a heavy candlestick from the altar. "It's the only way." But before he could swing, the door to the chapel shuddered violently as Withers's men began pounding against it, their voices rising in anger. "Hurry," Sally urged. Hale raised the candlestick, but just as he was about to bring it down on the tablet, the door burst open with a deafening crash. Withers's men poured into the chapel, their guns raised. "No," Withers shouted, his face contorted with rage. "Don't you dare destroy it." For a moment, everything froze. The men with their guns trained on Tony, Sally, and Hale. The tension in the air was electric. Then, in a blur of movement, Tony lunged forward, grabbing the candlestick from Hale's hand and swinging it down with all his strength. The candlestick slammed into the stone tablet with a sharp crack, shattering the ancient relic into pieces. A stunned silence followed, broken only by Withers's anguished cry of defeat. "You fools!" Withers shouted, his voice shaking with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tony stood tall. "We stopped you, Withers. It's over." Withers's face twisted in rage, but he didn't make a move. The artifact was gone, destroyed, and with it, his plans for power and control. Inspector Hale stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "You're under arrest, Withers, for the murder of Professor Blake and the conspiracy to traffic stolen artifacts." Withers glared at them, his chest rising and falling with barely contained rage, but he knew it was over. As Withers was led away in handcuffs, Tony and Sally exchanged a look, exhausted but relieved. It was finally over. Aftermath. The next few days passed in a blur of police reports, interviews, and the slow return to normalcy. "I still can't believe we did it," Tony said. "We actually solved the mystery." "I guess that means things will go back to normal," he said with a small grin. Sally laughed softly. "As normal as things can be after all of this." At that moment, Inspector Hale appeared in the doorway, his usual stern expression softened by a rare smile. He walked over to their table, tipping his hat in greeting. "You two did good work," Hale said, his voice warm with approval. "If it weren't for your instincts and determination, I'm not sure we would have uncovered the truth in time." Tony smiled. "Thanks, Inspector, but we couldn't have done it without you." Hale chuckled. "Well, let's just say we made a good team." As Hale turned to leave, Tony and Sally exchanged a glance, knowing that their days of sleuthing were far from over. The world was full of mysteries, and they had a knack for finding themselves right in the middle of them.